Now, over the past year, there's been a growing concern in the United States over what appeared to many to be a rise in anti-Semitism. Now, the Anti-Defamation League has published an annual report that confirms those fears, citing a 57% rise in such incidents in 2017. The biggest annual increase since the ADL began collecting this information. For more, we're joined in studio by our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman. Thank you for joining us, Owen. But first, let's speak with Evan Bernstein, the ADL's New York Regional Director. Evan, thank you so much for joining us, and tell us a little bit more about this disturbing report.
Anti-Semitic incidents taking place across the United States, and we saw a dramatic increase, as you stated earlier, the largest spike increase since we've seen since 1979. And here in New York City, we saw a 90% increase across New York State, really a 90% increase of anti-Semitic incidents, which is staggering for us and very concerning on many, many levels.
Evan, this report confirms the impression that a lot of people have over the past year. Incidents, the bigger incidents, for example, like in Charlottesville, and of course smaller incidents elsewhere. What are the reasons that could be behind the rise?
We've seen a real spike in anti-Semitism since the election season. And the NYPD here in New York has also confirmed that this has been kind of a spike that's stayed up and strong since the election season. Typically here in New York, when we see anti-Semitic incidents on the rise, it's around Israel, and it's around issues with Israel, whether it's Operation Protective Edge or something similar to that, and then the spike goes back down to normal levels. We have not seen that recession in numbers. It's actually increased clearly since 2016, which had large numbers as well. And I think we've seen this trend taking place since the election, and again, we're hoping that we can kind of turn things around, because these are trends that we don't like.
Owen, do you think that there's any possibility that these numbers could be blown out of proportion a little bit, like perhaps the number of incidents are increasing, but within a very small percentage of the population?
Well, Lauren, look, I think that the ADL clearly shows an increase of anti-Semitism, even with the caveats, and I think there are four. By the way, I should say, to give the ADL credit, you can easily see these caveats from the information that they're providing. Number one, and most importantly, 163 of these incidents are tied to one person, and he's a kid in Ashkelon. Remember those bomb threats against the JCCs in the early months of 2017? Well, it was not done by someone in the United States. It was done, as we said, by a kid in Ashkelon. i24NEWS went to his apartment building the night he was found. We talked to the neighbors. It doesn't really speak to trends in American society, to say the least, and it's an anomaly. So that's number one. By the way, that accounts for about a quarter of the increase. So you give that 57% increase a haircut of about 20 to 25%. That may be the more accurate number. That's number one. Number two, assault. The most serious category of incidents is actually down and down sharply. Again, the numbers there are very, very small. Hard to read too much into that. Number three, and here I'm a little bit unsure, but it seems based on the information the ADL has provided that a lot of the incidents are front-loaded to the early months of the year, and there may have been, a decrease going towards the end of 2017. And fourth, the caveat that's the Achilles heel of all of these reports, methodology and reporting. There may have just been an increase in reporting and not just an increase in incidents. Impossible to say. One last point. What the ADL is doing very, very clearly in this head, Jonathan Greenblatt is doing, is going straight at U.S. President Donald Trump, saying that it's him and his Twitter feed that's behind the increase. That's a risky approach. It seems that the ADL has made the decision that that's best for their organization and their organization's needs, and may well come from a heartfelt view and a view of the findings. I suspect a lot of people in the American Jewish community either will disagree or will agree, but be concerned that that approach is too high risk and will want to stay away.
Okay, Owen, good points, but let me note that Evan did make a point that these things tend to spike after elections, so that probably is one reason why I could account things will tend to be front-loaded. But Evan, I want you to reply perhaps to something Owen Alterman said here about the criticism that the ADL, which we should stress is a non-political, non-partisan organization, but it has criticized President Trump for some of the discourse that he's used that perhaps could have contributed to this. I'd like to give you a chance to respond on that.
I think clearly we've spoken now when we felt the president wasn't responsive as quickly or as emphatically on certain issues, whether it was around Charlottesville, whether it was around other issues. We've clearly been on the record. We've also been record on people that are not the President of the United States, whether it was during the election season when Bernie Sanders gave incorrect numbers around Gaza and the number of deaths in Gaza. We try really hard to stay in the middle as an organization. That's something that Jonathan Greenblatt strives to do. But when we see something that we disagree with, we will call that out, whether it's the president or any elected official or any individual in this country or abroad. And I think that's something that people look to the ADL to do. They look to be centered and call it like we see it, and people are going to know our voice on these issues. And we don't hesitate when we see something that we feel is inappropriate. And if it's the President of the United States, we're going to do that. And again, if it's somebody else, a business leader, an individual, we're going to do that as well. And I think, for us, we expect leaders to lead in all forms. And the President of the United States needs to be somebody that is leading and showing as an example to other elected officials, whether they're federal or local, on how to speak out loudly and emphatically against these kinds of groups and these issues. And we'd expect that from him or any other person in elected office.
Well, Evan, what should the Jewish community and perhaps lawmakers be doing to address this problem?
I sat with Governor Cuomo last year almost to the day when he announced a plan to push back against anti-Semitism and hate in New York State. And what he did is, I think, an ideal example for an elected official. It's to speak out loudly and emphatically, create a plan, and put resources behind that plan. I think that's what elected needs to be doing right now. They need to be listening to their constituents. They need to be hearing what's going on in the given communities. They need to understand that certain communities that maybe weren't as affected by anti-Semitism, like here in New York, Manhattan led with the number of anti-Semitic incidents. Typically, it's Queens or Brooklyn, not Manhattan. That is something that people need to be aware of. Electeds need to understand that there's been shifts and things happening. And, I think our work with law enforcement and our educational work with the departments of education across the country are more critical than ever. But I think that those are the focuses that we need to be looking at right now.
Okay, we can, of course, quibble about the numbers and the amounts, but clearly anti-Semitism is still a very live, active issue that the Jewish community and the wider community in the U.S. and certainly elsewhere have to be worried about. Evan Bernstein of the ADL, thanks for joining us. And, of course, our own Owen Alterman, thank you for being in the studio on The Rundown.